is an expansion of my blog in which I explain my starting job as municipal judge in Lyons, Colorado. It was kind of an interesting gig for me. I got out of law school and went to work with this tax lawyer in Boulder, which is curious, which started my career in doing marijuana cases, because under the law at that time, marijuana was considered a tax violation, and they charged people under the Internal Revenue Code. That's a whole different matter, a whole different era. In any event, I got on this plan at CU where I started taking graduate courses, which would accelerate advanced degrees, but I was a little bit too politically active back then, I guess. And anyway, Barry Goldwater was running for president, and there was all kinds of stuff going on. The general NATO had been fired for indoctrinating troops, and he was sent to teach an ROTC course at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, which is very curious. His name was Major General Walker. Some theorists think that maybe Oswald took a pot shot at him before shooting at Kennedy, if he shot at Kennedy. In any event, at that time I was interested in mainly political sociology, but also concentration in criminology. I was also working in a barber shop, and about half of our clients were faculty members. The guy I worked with was an Italian professor, and he and his wife wanted to adopt a child, and they couldn't make enough money as faculty members to do so through the Department of Welfare. And at that point, he quit the language department at CU and went to work as a barber, bought a barber shop, and was able to adopt a child. It was unfortunate back then that the wages of a barber were much better than that of a faculty professor. But in any event, we attracted several graduate students and professors into the shop. It was a small shop, and also a lot of prominent townspeople, things like this. The environment there was more like an intellectual debate society than a shop. One of the things that happens in barbershops is you get a chance to really work with your customers, you get to know them, you have a captive audience to talk to for half an hour. It was like getting private lectures in various things. If you have an inquisitive mind and know what questions to ask, you can learn a lot. And I think I did. Anyway, after a political brouhaha or so at CU, I was essentially offered a chance to leave and save my skin. I was organizing for American Federation of Teachers at that time. And I was also the vice president of a union in town, and belonging to Colorado Labor Council, and was active in labor and economic issues and things like this. So I left Boulder and went to law school. And the last year in Boulder, there was some interesting things going on politically. Kennedy had been assassinated, and my wife had a job teaching school in Jefferson County, and one of her colleagues' husband was a special forces type at Loveland Air Force Base. And there was an article in Life magazine, front page of soldiers going to Vietnam. And the story was that we had sent people to Vietnam as advisors. And he was looking through the magazine. He commented on the front page, he said, all these people are carrying weapons. That really doesn't look like a like an advisor situation to me. It looks like the combat troops. So I didn't think too much about that until I got to Chicago. And law school was a lot easier than graduate school, frankly, and I had a lot more spare time. The reading wasn't nearly as much, and the intellectual content, once you got the foundation and the idea that was based on Socratic method, was fairly easy to pick up. So in any event, I had lots of spare time there and got interested in politics. And one of the first things that I did outside of trying to work with Blackstone Rangers was to get involved in anti-Vietnam activity. It was an interesting thing that this is a year after Kennedy got assassinated. Most of the people that I went to law school with were inspired by the do what you can for your country speech of Kennedy. We were idealistic young people interested in civil rights, civil liberties, the poor, helping the downtrodden, etc. There were a few traditional law students coming from fairly well-to-do family that were interested in whatever the upper middle class students were interested at that time. But MA's group was pretty much dichotomous. The school was. I got active in some groups, one of which was the Committee of 1,000, headed by a guy named Hans Bordathal out of the University of Chicago. There were a few other things out of the University of Chicago that I participated in. I signed up to do teach-ins and a lot of other educational type programs. And we went to a lot of meetings and did a lot of things. I was on the Human Relations Council in Park Ridge. We were trying to figure out a way to integrate the city or the township, which was really difficult because it was upper middle class suburban area, and the probability of any blacks having enough money to move in there was very slim, so we could be very liberal on the issue and things like that because integration probably would never happen there anyway. At least that's the impression I got of the group. They were well-meaning and active as long as it wasn't in their own backyard. Through there, I met some of the people working for King. I participated in a couple marches that King led and was active with various. Mary and Lyndon Johnson exempted every married man with an A1-2 classification. I think it was back in 63 or 64. So there wasn't much chance, at least until war was declared, that I'd be drafted. And I was young though. I was 2 years younger than my classmates at that time. And they all got draft deferments and things like that. So when graduation time came, I was pretty well involved in, I guess you'd call them leftist political movements. I would call them progressive, but that's just a semantic difference. The last year I worked with a fellow named Leonard Carlin, who's a Lawyers Guild activist, working on anti-war things, was working on war crimes, indictments, things like this. Used the UN Charter a lot in his briefs. He mainly wrote briefs. An interesting thing happened. He did get a call to represent George Lincoln Rockwell when he was marching against the Jews in Skokie, Illinois. He didn't take that case, but it was an interesting occurrence in any event. So my last year of law school, I did mainly political activities with a few classes and got ready to graduate. One of the things we did one year was go up to Madison and plant grave markers on the quadrangle up there like they had in Normandy. Another interesting thing we did was have working with Blackstone Rangers, things like that, with the idea of black capitalism and working with some of those guys. The social workers were really interesting as far as learning skills of community organization and things such as that. I also, at that time, worked part-time in a barber shop, and I was doing pretty well there. We were charging $20 for a haircut back in 1965, and I did a lot of razor cutting and a high-end type thing. We had a high-end salon and was located in a fancy area called Gulf, Illinois, which is near North Shore and centered around various golf clubs. And a lot of the people were pilots and executives and things such as this. So I was part-time working with Appalachian whites in North Chicago, and other part-time working in the upper class executives out in the suburbs. It was an interesting contrast. In any event, when I came back to Colorado and took this job at a law firm, one of the things that Colorado had done is passed a statute that municipal judges had to have law degrees. Prior to that, they were the local butcher, baker, candlestick maker type. The concept of municipal judge was traffic judge. They weren't called municipal judges, and they were called justices of the peace. And it was kind of a scam. You would get a ticket from a cop. You would appear in front of the JP, the Justice of the Peace, and you would pay a fine. If you had a trial and lost, you would pay a fine. But there was always court costs, which is the judge's money and the city's money. And it was kind of a racket. The courts and judges would kind of split the money, and the money would go to the police fund to buy gadgets and things like this, and take up some of the pressure, take off some of the pressure on town councils to pay for various things. Well, that changed when they amended the Colorado Constitution, so I was the first judge in this small town with a law degree and recognized as a member of the state court system, things like this. It was quite a change for the state, quite a change for the system, and nobody knew quite what to do with us. But I took my job seriously, and I went to a lot of conferences and tried to learn what a judge was, how they worked, and all this kind of stuff. But there was a constant pressure between the ideological idea of what a judge was and the concept of lawyers of what a judge should be, and the concept of everyone else that they were a traffic racket scam to get money for the town. And one way of alleviating pressure on taxpayers. So you had that internal definition conflict from the beginning. So it wasn't an easy place to be the first person to be a judge, because I was always getting pressure from the city police, the chief of police, to do this, that, or the other, to find more people guilty because they needed the money. They came in and they wanted a new radio system, and I said, go to the town council and get it appropriated. Well, no, it comes out of the police fund. Well, I explained they didn't have a police fund anymore. It came out of the general fund. You had to go in front of the town council. Well, they said, we don't care what it says. We've always done it this way, and we want this, we want that. They wanted fire hoses so they could clean the hippies. There was, at that time, a lot of cultural changes going on. Boulder had an influx of what they called hippies. And the hippies said that the asteroid Kohoutek was going to crash into the Earth, and the only safe place on Earth was Boulder, and they were coming from all over. It was a long hair culture, it was drug culture. Buddhists came in, beating their drums, Hare Krishnas. various gurus from all over the world, like from Indonesia or Tibet, Nepal, etc. And it was kind of some people described it as a meeting place for weirdos. There was a group in Boulder called the STP family. They were drug cultivated with STP, which was a form of LSD. You had the Divine Light people, Sunshine people. Most of these revolved around LSD. Of course, there was a whole bunch of marijuana people, and there was anti-war protests and social upheaval everywhere that the mainstream media and older people wanted to blame on drugs. And there was also still the fear of communists from the Eisenhower administration. We were only 4 years away from the Eisenhower years, and everybody was afraid of commies. The commies are coming, and funny movies came out at that time. The Russians are coming. The Russians are coming was one of them, with Alan Arkin. Another one was Dr. Strangelove, which was funny as hell, with what the hell, I can't think of his name now. Peter Sellers, and various other put-ons. But there was also at that time a lot of protests going on. And a lot of the parents of the protesters served in World War II. They said, well, we did our duty. We got shot at. We went to war against the Germans and the Japanese. And it's your patriotic duty to go to war. Some of my classmates in law school would say things like, my country, right or wrong, my country. If they tell you to go, you go. And some of us in the more intellectual sphere said, well, this is not constitutional. They haven't declared war. They haven't done this. They haven't done that. Who's benefiting from all of this? Why are they pushing it, etc.? And a lot of that followed some of the conspiracy theories from the Kennedy assassination. And it was really a time of turmoil. So I take this job as judge in Lyons, and it was my own little war. At the same time, my activism had caught up with me. I was still eligible for the draft because I'd never had a draft deferment because I'd never needed one, so I wasn't too concerned. But my local draft board decided they should call me anyway. And when they drafted me, they had all kinds of files of my political activities, and it was obvious it was sort of a retaliatory induction in order to keep my mouth shut and stop activism. I protested and demanded a hearing. Well, I was curious. And one of the first defenses I had was, well, first off, I said I was exempt because Johnson signed the exemption. Secondly, that I never had a student exemption, and they ran out of time to draft me out of it after I got out of law school. Thirdly, they couldn't draft me because our government, it was founded on 3 branches, and the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Under the state constitution, I was a member of the judicial branch, and they weren't drafting mayors, congressmen, state representatives, state senators, town councilmen, etc. And they couldn't draft me because I was an elected official. The meeting there was kind of funny, and one of the old timers on the draft board said, well, we've never ever had an application to defer or not draft or exempt on the basis of somebody being a judge. And I said, well, that's because most judges are old farts and they're beyond the draft age anyway. I'm an exception, and I'm claiming that. So there was a big debate going on, and the hearing lasted a couple of days. And finally, they issued an order to draft me. One of the other grounds of appeal, too, was the fact that I had worked on the Merriweather case and knew a little bit about deferments. And secondly, that aside from probably being 4F, which I didn't want to contest, that it was retaliatory for my political activity. At the same time, my younger brother was in the Air Force. He was a B-52 pilot, and they approached him and said, you're not going to make captain if your brother doesn't stop this political activity. And my brother calmly looked at him and he said, well, I thought freedom of speech is what I was fighting for. And that ended that debate. Anyway, all of this stuff is going on around me. I'm trying to develop a law practice. I'm trying to learn how to be a judge, trying to learn how to do various other things. And all these distractions were mind-boggling. In any event, I appealed my draft board's decision to induct me. And it went to the appeal board. And at that time, there was a rule at the appeal board that if there was one dissent, it went to the president. So President Johnson, and it never got returned, so I never knew exactly what status was. As far as I know, I was 1A and never got called because the next year they started the lottery number and I wasn't in that pool, so I sort of got lost in limbo. I suspect it was probably intentional because there was another aspect to this, and that had to do with the Merriweather case. And at that time, there was a provision in the draft code about alternative service. And the alternative service provision was you could volunteer for alternative service in lieu of the draft. So you could do this, that, or the other as long as the draft board said that would be alternative service and serve your country. Well, that was pretty good, and I think the general was Westmoreland or something like that. That was the head of the conducted or selected service. In any event, there's this guy named Merriweather who had a master's degree in accounting from Roosevelt University, and he volunteered for alternative service as a conscientious objector and was accepted. Meanwhile, at one of the hospitals in Chicago, the hospital administrators kept getting drafted. Now here you got Merriweather with a master's degree in accounting, working emptying bedpans as an orderly in the hospital, and the administrators keep getting drafted. And the directors had a meeting and said, well, why don't we just make Merriweather our administrator? He's already deferred, he's doing alternative service, and things like this. So they did. Right away, Merriweather gets drafted. And the head of the draft board, I think it was General Hershey or something like that, signed the induction order himself. So Merriweather came to the law firm that I was clerking for, and my boss took the case, so I got to go with it to court on the Merriweather case. And he got the general to admit that he felt that alternative service was unpatriotic, that these people should be treated as criminals, they should be punished, and alternative service should be equal to punishment. So emptying bedpans as an orderly was a good thing. Being a hospital administrator at $50,000 a year, $40,000, whatever it was back then, was not a good thing. So the guy should be inducted because it was an abuse of the alternative service condition. I'm trying to set sort of a pattern here of when I started out in this judgment. The people were pretty well convinced and dichotomous about the anti-war bad guys, the pre-war good guys. At that time, it was considered to be un-American if you protested the war. And a curious thing happened. The police departments captivated the signs, the symbols of patriotism, and all of a sudden started putting U.S. flags on their arm badges. showing that they were the good guys, they were the citizens, they were the patriots, and all these long-haired bastards ought to be locked up, have their haircuts and hair's cut and put in the field. It was kind of interesting the dynamics there, because all of a sudden the right wing started requisitioning symbols of our government, of our country, etc., and they co-opted the whole patriotic ideal or sign or whatever you'd want to call it. So if you were a commie, you didn't have a flag on your sleeve, that you were probably a commie or pro-commie or something. Things such as this. There were protests going on everywhere, street protests, and most of the protesters had long hair. Even the soldiers that came back for Vietnam on leave that went to the protest bought wigs so they could have long hair. Nobody appeared that wanted to be cool. Nobody appeared with short hair. This was the environment that was going on at this time. So I'm going up there hearing kind of cases, and it didn't take me long to figure out it was a scam. They had speeding tickets for people going over 15 miles an hour on this curve coming down from Estes Park, and we had all kinds of speeding violations. But the state law said no matter what the speed limit is, if the speed is reasonable and proper, it wasn't a violation. So the first thing I did is I ruled that going over 15 miles an hour down a major U.S. highway through a town was reasonable and proper. It was unreasonable and improper to cut it down to 15 miles an hour, which cost a lot of revenue for the town, and they were pissed off about it. They sort of lived with it. But they got around it by putting dirt on the yellow lines of the road markings, and then they would say that the vehicles crossed the double yellow lines on a turn and write them up for careless driving. Well, after listening to a few of those cases, I said, that's foul. You guys are trying to circumvent what my ruling is, so I'm not going to find any of these people guilty anymore. So then they had to sort of play it straight. Well, there was this comedy cop show on television where they were getting all these funds from government. The cops wanted to buy a tank with a battering ram on it and all kinds of extra equipment that they probably never used. It was surplus equipment that was out there, and they wanted it because cops always wanted toys. And they'd come to me and they said, we want this. No, we want a fire truck so we can hose the hippies that are protesting. No, you got to go to council for that. And they weren't getting any money out of the police fund. And they got pissed off. And that really started friction. When I wouldn't find long hairs guilty just because they had long hair, that added to it. Various decisions, they started tallying up on the chalkboard. And I knew it was a matter of time. So they run out of money and they started paying me with warrants. And I could cash the warrants when I collected enough money in the court fund to get paid. And that war went on for a while. Finally, it came down to election time, and essentially there was a contest between the old mayor and the new mayor, and the margin of vote was one. The new mayor won by one vote, and he was the law and order guy, and the cops loved him. So his first thing was to hire me, and that was the end of my gig as a municipal judge. Or I was still unsure whether I was working for the Department of Revenue. It's curious, in Colorado, because all the traffic tickets are administered, and driver's licenses, etc., are administered by the Department of Revenue. The Department of Revenue has its own administrative law judge and its own court, and has very little to do with the usual court system. So essentially what the state of Colorado tried to do was integrate a martial law or administrative law procedure into the constitutional court sector and it met with a lot of resistance because, unlike Europe, the traffic courts were set up as revenue generators in the first place and always looked upon as that, which later generations are going to start causing conflict between the police and the citizenry. Other things that happened back then is you had inspection stickers for your vehicles, and every so often you had to go have the vehicle checked to see whether your lights worked and your brakes worked. That was a matter of safety. Well, they changed that and privatized it and put in a bunch of these little independent stations that checked for violations on emissions. That really didn't have any to do with the attitude of government was more toward marketing some of its services and supporting government business partnerships and making money for those partnerships than to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens. Now, to me, that was a big jump, but nobody really picked up on it or talked about it. But that was the beginning of the end of our whole justice system, because the whole government then became revenue collectors rather than helpmates for the citizenry. The next thing they did is they changed the concept of police a little bit. When I was growing up, the policeman was your friend. It was a small town, of course, but the police carried a little bit of extra gas in case the people ran out of gas. They had jumper cables. They were called the courtesy patrol, and they would go to see if they could help motorists. And when they weren't helping motorists, they'd occasionally write a traffic ticket, but they didn't make a big deal about it. The police cars were clearly marked. They weren't stealth cars to trap unwary drivers. The police went out into the community and participated in community events. And it was a whole different idea. It wasn't a them and us situation as happened because of the Vietnam War or during the Vietnam War. It was more of a cooperative effort. I know back then I used to have lunch with the prosecutor at least once a week. We used to discuss various electoral procedural problems with the court system. We would talk about some of our cases. We bounce ideas off of each other. And it was all one group. We were in sync, trying to do something about law breaking and helping people, and even helping the lawbreakers so they wouldn't break the law again. There wasn't this, everybody but a cop was a scumbag that you've got now with the attitude it wasn't a them and us situation. And in fact, I represented brothers and cousins of 4 deputy district attorneys in Boulder on draft cases, for instance, and other cases, and also a couple divorces, things like this. So it was not the dichotomous atmosphere that we see today. But the legal profession was sort of united that way. But the police were tied in with the idea of collecting revenue and making the town, making it an example of a perfect town. I know one time the police came to me and says, why don't you charge the tourists 3 or 4 times what you do the locals? That'll bring up the revenue. I deny equal protection law. I can't charge tourists more than non-tourists. And what they did do, though, was they did encourage a lot of tourists to mail in their fines or their tickets with the fine. And they generally add another charge. This is expired license or whatever, so they could add another $10-$20. And they would tack on court fees that wasn't on the ticket that I didn't know about till later. And they did little subterfuges like that. That would make it kind of an interesting game. But in all, outside of the revenue generation, there was a spirit and a consensus that our problem, that our job was to take care of crime or misconduct or whatever and be reasonable about it. We wouldn't shoot mice with cannons, for instance. There was the idea of, the penalty should fit the crime. And if a guy's spitting on the sidewalks, you don't take him to the guillotine, things like this. There was an idea of proportionality, which seems to have escaped judges and prosecutors in the last couple, 3 decades. There's no proportionality anymore. There's no prerogative effort. It's the police against everyone else. It's the prosecutors hating the defense attorneys. The judges all coming from the prosecuting attorneys who have this innate hate for defense attorneys. Things like that didn't exist over the last 50 years. And in the meantime, what that's doing, or what has happened, is we've abolished common law in this country. We no longer have common law. Common law was something that was common to everybody. Everybody knew what it was. Everybody was presumed to know what the law was, and it worked pretty well. But then with various other factors and the struggle for power, particularly over the Nixon years, that got changed. One of the big differences is the power distribution. Power under common law comes from the bottom down. The people above you get their power because of the legitimization of your acquiescing to their power. Whereas Napoleonic Code, power comes from the top down. You're appointed into a tribunal or into an inquisitor slot or whatever. Your power comes from the state, and whether the public like it or not is too bad, because you're sort of a demigod God. So we'll have more on this. I'm going to do a series on all the changes since Nixon and how it's wrecked our democratic system, how it's wrecked our law system, how it's abolished common law, and how it really is trending toward martial law. You can't have a democratic state under Napoleonic Code. The only way you can have democracy and freedom, in fact, is to have the power from the people up. Power has to come from the people. You can't push people around with administrative laws or legislation or stacking the court system or attacking judges as being liberal when they follow the Constitution. The power has to come from consensus, and we don't have that anymore. So I hope you continue this. By the way, I've got a few sponsors now, and maybe I can improve the quality of these broadcasts, but they're not going anywhere unless I get some more responses, because I feel if nobody's really thinking about these things, what's the use? So please respond, please like my channel, please recommend it to others. If you think my heads-ons walk wrong or I'm full of shit or whatever, please write a comment and tell me so. I'll try to answer as many as I can. And thank you for watching and listening. This is the Dangerous Dinosaur, and I'm gone.